Well, it's a pleasure to be with an audience that doesn't want to kill me for the first time in about 3 weeks. Amy was there, so she knows. I mean, it was Cal State LA was a little bit more than protesters. People protesting is fine. It wasn't just they blocked the exits. I mean, people who were trying to get in were being literally physically pushed around. People were being assaulted. They had to sneak in people 2 or 3 at a time into the room. It was the Free Speech Underground Railroad. They had to take the cops and get people into the room 2 or 3 at a time in order to make sure that they could hear the lecture. Somebody pulled the fire alarm about 10 minutes in to try and shut down the speech. We spoke right through it. And then afterward, the cops told us that if we tried to wade out into the crowd, it actually would have started a riot. So I had to be spirited away by 10 to 15 uniformed police officers, put into an unmarked car, driven off campus by 2 motorcycles flashing their lights. There were multiple television, police helicopters all around the place. And then, as I predicted during the speech, the protesters left there, went directly to the president's office to try and ask for his resignation for allowing me to speak, even though he hadn't allowed me to speak. We told him to go screw himself and went there despite his disapproval. So, with all that out of the way, let's talk about how you can debate folks on the left, because this is sort of my specialty. It's what if I'm known for anything, it's debating folks on the left, although lately it seems I'm known for a lot of bizarre things. So in any case, let's start with here are the 10 rules for debating the left. Let's start with the question, when should you bother debating people on the left? Right? Everybody always thinks, I see a leftist, I'll debate the leftist. Not true. There are only a couple situations in which it is worthwhile to debate somebody who is on the left. One is you found the one honest leftist in America. Congratulations. There's only one of them, and he's walking around in Nebraska somewhere. Sometimes he rides a donkey. But aside from that, you will not find him, so that's not real. The second time you should debate a leftist is if it's in public. If it's in public and there are other people watching, you should debate a leftist. And that's what these tactics are for, right? These tactics are specifically for when you're debating a leftist in public. And the goal of this debate is not to convince the leftist, because leftists are not easily convinced because they operate from the cockles of their small hearts and even tinier brains. So the goal here is not to actually convince the leftist, it's to humiliate them as badly as possible in front of as large a number of people as possible. So here is how you actually do that. The reason for that is because politics, unfortunately, but just realistically, is blood sport. Politics is a game where there are winners and there are losers. It is not just a wonderful discussion where people trade ideas. Not anymore. It hasn't been, certainly for my entire adult lifetime. And when I talk to folks who are above the age of 60, they tend to remember a time where politics was a lot more genial, where you could actually have political conversations without people getting in each other's faces and implying that their political opponents were bad human beings. This is no longer the case. The left basically has one argument against all of you, and that one argument is, you're a terrible person. That's the argument, right? I mean, you're on campuses, you're in high school, you know this, right? When you talk about any issue from the right, the answer is, well, that's because you're a racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe who hates the poor, right? That's always what it comes down to. You're a terrible, horrible human being. So here is how we're going to, tonight, we're going to teach you how to rebut this particular presumption. So here are the 10 rules. The first rule is you have to hit first. You have to walk toward the fire. So this is something I learned from my mentor, Andrew Breitbart. The idea is that you can't avoid the battle. You can try and be nice, you can try and run away from the battle, but the reality is that you are going to become a centerpiece. If you decide to go into politics at all, even to discuss it, you are going to be the focal point in a battle. So just walk toward the fire, embrace it. It's fun. Believe it or not, it's fun. It actually is. Even though, there's the occasional death threat, and by occasional I mean constant, but it actually is a lot of fun to do this. I have a lot of fun doing it. And if you're not having fun doing it, you're not doing it right. And you can tell, by the way, with political candidates, the ones who have fun on the campaign trail tend to be the ones who are successful. People like to watch people who are having fun engaging in the battle. This is the happy warrior kind of idea. Walk toward the fire, embrace it. It's going to get ugly, but that's okay because you know how to punch. Okay, the second rule is you need to frame your opponent. So as I mentioned, the chief tactic of the left is that you're not a good person, right? It's unearned moral superiority. Leftists don't do anything for the world, okay? Leftism doesn't do anything for the world. Leftism is a philosophy of stealing and taking and voting for people to put a gun to somebody else's head to take crap from you for their own personal betterment, right? That's what leftism is. Socialism is the most selfish philosophy in human history. It's the basic notion that I'm breathing and therefore you owe me crap, okay? But the way they sleep at night, because they're not adding anything to the general productivity with this philosophy, is, but yes, I'm a better person than you. So your job is to rip away that facade, because they're not. They believe in a really terrible philosophy. So you have to frame your opponent. Right? So most famously, I did this probably in the Piers Morgan interview. I've done it many times, but I don't know how many of you have seen this interview I did with Piers Morgan. It's now about 3 years ago on CNN, right after Sandy Hook. It was an interview on gun control. It tells you that it's been a while because Piers Morgan hasn't been on TV for a while, partially because of things like this. And we started the debate, and he wanted to try to explain to me why gun control was a wonderful thing. And before he could even start, he'd been spending days, weeks, proclaiming that anybody who didn't believe in his brand of gun control, anyone who didn't believe in his particular notion of what we ought to do with gun law, that person didn't care enough about the dead children in Sandy Hook. So he started off the interview by saying, Mr. Shapiro, you've called me a bully. Why? And I said, because you are a bully and you stand on the graves of the children of Sandy Hook in order to push your political agenda. And he had nothing to say to that, because it was true. And he kind of clutched his pearls and said, how dare you? And I said, right, but I watch your show, it's true. And he said, again, how dare you? And I said, again, I watch your show, it's true. By framing my opponent, he could no longer put himself in this higher moral category. There was no way for him to portray himself as the figure on the rock preaching the gospel to people. He couldn't do that anymore. I had taken that away from him. The high moral ground no longer belonged to him. And you have to do this with folks on the left. You can't accept their premise. You have to frame your opponent. This is because, unfortunately, people on the right, we like to argue in terms of policies and in terms of information. Folks on the left like to argue in terms of character. Right? Folks on the left love this. This is why Hillary Clinton's entire argument against people on the right is that they're terrible human beings who want to hurt folks, right? This is Hillary's argument. This is Bernie Sanders' argument. Right? Bernie Sanders has no intelligible argument. I'm not even sure he speaks an intelligible language. But what he does say is that everybody who opposes him is a bad person who doesn't care about the poor enough, while playing the air bongos. If you were debating Bernie Sanders, for example, the first thing that you would say to Bernie Sanders is, Bernie, you like to sit on your high horse and talk about how much people ought to give, what is their fair share. Why is it that you honeymooned in the USSR while it was literally shipping people off to gulags and then killing them? Why is it that you were so okay with the Sandinistas in Nicaragua and you actually made Burlington, Vermont, a sister city to the capital of Nicaragua, in the middle of a time when leftist tyrants were murdering people in the streets? Why is that okay with you? What's wrong with you as a human being? Put him on the defense. You have to frame him as a person, right? Because now he knows. He's on notice. It's mutually assured destruction. If he's going to bring a character attack, you're going to bring a character attack, and yours is based on fact while his isn't. So you have to frame your opponent. Rule number 3, you have to frame the debate. So what the left likes to do is argue the debate in their terms. And they have all sorts of tricks for this. So, for example, on same-sex marriage, the way they frame the debate is always, why do you want to stop two people who love each other from marrying each other? This is always the way that they discuss this issue, right? That's always the question. And the answer to that isn't, well, I do want to stop those people from marrying each other. The answer is, why do you think a child does not deserve a mother and a father? Or you have to change the terms of the debate, because they're actually two separate questions. And the second one is significantly more important, because personally, I don't care about what two people want to do with their lives. That's their problem. I may think it's sinful, but welcome to America, where I can think something's a sin and you don't have to agree. The problem that I have is when you're suggesting that government ought to value certain relationships above others when those relationships are specifically about the bearing and rearing of children. Right? So you have to reframe the debate. You have to find the actual reality of the debate, not the happy talk, not the happy emotional talk of the left. What is the debate actually about? Okay, the fourth point here, you need to spot inconsistencies in the left's argument. This takes research. You actually have to know the left's arguments better than they do. So I'm sure that a large number of college students here go to college campuses that orient to the left, that are very much to the left. Good. This will make you a better weapon. Really, I went to UCLA, I went to Harvard Law. I can argue the left side of the position pretty much as well as any leftist. And I'm talking about high-level leftists. Because if you spend time learning their arguments and then learning to counter those arguments, you're never surprised. And it turns out that the vast majority of people on the left are wildly inconsistent, internally inconsistent about their arguments. Because the truth is that if they told you what they really believed, everyone hates that. right? What the left actually believes deep down is so reprehensible and so repugnant and so gross that they will never say it out loud. Instead, they cover it in a sort of patter that's completely inconsistent. So to give a gun example, one of the things you'll hear from the left about guns is that assault weapons bans are the greatest idea in the world, which makes no sense, right? The vast majority of murders that are committed with guns are committed with handguns. Why don't they want to ban handguns? The answer is, well, this is true also. There's no such thing as an assault weapon. But the internal inconsistency in their argument, is that they say assault weapons are bad because they kill lots of people. The truth is that handguns are used in far more murders than so-called assault weapons. So why don't they want to ban handguns? Okay, now the reality is they do want to ban handguns. But when you get them to admit that, it makes them uncomfortable because no one actually wants to ban handguns in the United States except for like 5 people, and they're all in the Obama administration. So you can always spot that the left is filled with these sorts of inconsistencies, right? Even on global warming, they say, well, global warming, it's going to heat up the world and we're all going to die and the polar bears are going to drown. They won't be able to drink Coca-Cola anymore. It's going to be all sad. And don't you want to stop that? And then you say to them, well, but by your own scientific studies, isn't it true that you don't know what level of carbon emissions lead to a certain level of temperature increase? So given that, according to your own studies, we could dramatically decrease the amount of carbon we're putting into the atmosphere, and we'll still increase the temperature. The amount of the temperature increase will still happen according to your own models because that carbon's already in the atmosphere. There's no way to stop that. And they have no answer for that because it's internally inconsistent, because the real agenda for global warming is a giant economic leveling and taking down of Western economies in favor of less developed economies, because essentially the people pushing this are economic Marxists. Okay, 5th point. You have to force the left to answer questions. You may notice that I'm slightly aggressive in my style. There's a reason for this. This is because if you're on the defensive, you're losing. Right? There's no such thing as playing defense in politics. You're on the offensive all the time. You're forcing them to answer questions. The left loves nothing better than to just grill you as though you're a defendant on the stand. But the truth is you don't have to defend yourself against their attacks. They need to defend themselves against your attacks. So anytime you're asked a question, you should think, okay, how can I flip this so that I'm asking them a question, so I'm putting them on the defensive, right? Any of these inconsistencies is a good example of doing that. You can put them on the defensive and force them to answer questions. Leftists hate answering questions because it makes them think, and thinking is not their strong suit. Feeling is their strong suit. So if you get them away from feeling, which you did with the character argument at the beginning, and now they have to think, which is what you're trying to make them do now, they get all confused, and then they sort of start crying, and it gets all awkward, and then you have to apologize because you ruined the dinner party, but it was fun anyway. Okay. The 6th point here is not getting distracted. So you'll notice when you're in debate with folks on the left, they always have a red herring. It's amazing. I've been giving this particular speech, I've been giving for probably 5 years at YAF, and they're still using the same red herring. They still use it, right? It's the only one that they have. Right, so you're talking about Barack Obama's foreign policy is terrible. It's just terrible. The world's on fire. He's been feckless. He's incentivized all of America's enemies to become more powerful and more anti-American. People are dying all over the world because of President Obama's foreign policies. And the first thing they do is they scream in agony, and their head swivels full 360 degrees, and they vomit in all directions, and then they shout, "Bush," right? Like Linda Blair from The Exorcist. Which is a reference that your parents will get, but you may not. So like Linda Blair from The Exorcist. So in any case, the proper answer is don't get distracted by George W. Bush. Okay, first of all, he's not that distracting. Second of all, George W. Bush is not relevant to this conversation. Okay, he's not. What does it matter what George W. Bush did in 2003 in Iraq? What matters is what you're doing right now. Right? We're not talking about that. If you want to debate Iraq, we can also debate whether it would have been better if Woodrow Wilson had stuck with his Russian intervention in 1919 instead of allowing the Russian Reds to beat the Russian Whites. I mean, if we're going to do a historical debate, let's go all the way back to the beginning. Let's do this thing, right? Let's talk about John C. Calhoun, right? Let's talk about Millard Fillmore. Let's go all the way back, right? Let's talk about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Hell, let's go back to Adam and Eve. I mean, that was a big debate, wasn't it? Let's take this sucker all the way back to the top. The proper answer to Bush is Woodrow Wilson, right? Next time somebody says Bush, you just say Woodrow Wilson or James Garfield. Pick a random president and just say it back to them, because that's about as relevant. It's not relevant. You don't have to follow them down their imaginary silly rabbit holes. Okay, 7th point. If you don't know something, you need to admit it right off the bat. So this is where more people get caught in debate than any place else. If Donald Trump were a normal candidate, he'd get caught on this all the time, right? Because Donald Trump literally knows nothing. He knows zero things. The number of things he knows has actually started to decrease into the negatives, right? He's making up things that he doesn't know now. So one of the gaffes that Donald Trump had, he was being interviewed by Hugh Hewitt, and Hugh Hewitt asked him about the nuclear triad. And Donald Trump didn't know what the nuclear triad was. Okay, fair enough. Just say, look, Hugh, I'm not an expert on the nuclear triad. Maybe I'll make you my defense secretary. Right? That would actually be a decent answer. Right? Or I don't know the answer to your question. I want to research it and get back to you later. That's okay. What you probably shouldn't do is do the things that Trump does, which are, by the way, are not going to fly in a general election. Things like where Donald Trump is asked about the Al-Quds force, and he says, oh, the Kurds. And then he says that he misheard, right? He just makes things up on the fly. Or he's asked in the last debate about H-1B visas, and he just shifts his position 180 degrees because he doesn't even know his own position because he can't read. So the point here being, you don't have to pretend to know things that you don't, because that's the easiest way to get in trouble in a debate. Because usually the left, they don't know many facts, but they usually know like one, and it doesn't have anything to do with anything usually. You know, you're talking about something, and they say, well, did you know that the air speed of a swallow in flight, right? And you're supposed to come back with something, and it's like, no, I'll check that out, I guess. I mean, okay, you know, let me do some research. Let me do some research and get back to you is actually a fair answer in debate. You're allowed to say it. You don't have to be the person who knows everything. Nobody knows everything. I'm close, but nobody knows everything. Okay, 8th point. You don't have to get sucked in by the paradigm. So it turns out that you're arguing your own beliefs and your own positions. That means you don't have to defend anybody else's beliefs and positions if you don't believe them. This is actually, I think, a great danger in American politics, is that people feel the necessity to defend positions they don't like and don't hold just because it's our guy. So, for example, everybody likes Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan's great. Okay, we're all agreed, right? Ronald Reagan's terrific. Okay. Ronald Reagan did stuff that was not great. Ronald Reagan, for example, passed amnesty, right? Not a great thing. Thing we all agree at this point, not a wonderful thing. Ronald Reagan was working with a Congress that raised spending. Not a wonderful thing. Ronald Reagan acknowledged he made mistakes. Ronald Reagan, when he was running for president, acknowledged the biggest mistake he made was in this state when he made abortion more available. Right? People make mistakes. That's okay. And you're allowed to say, I disagree with that position. You're allowed to say, you know what, that's just not something. We can argue this, but honestly, it's not a position I hold passionately. You don't have to be sucked in by the paradigm. So if somebody says to you, well, you know, that's not what Bush says. Okay, so what? If you don't agree with Bush, you don't agree with Bush. He's not God, right? There's only one of them. So there's no reason why you have to follow or idolize a politician to the extent that you're going to shift your own positions based on idolatry of a politician. 9th point. It's actually kind of fun once in a while to let the other side have meaningless victories. This makes you look moderate, which is the left's favorite thing. So one of the things that you can do with the left is they like to play these linguistic games. So, for example, immigration reform. Right? The whole purpose of the immigration reform discussion is to make you sound like you hate Mexicans. Right? That's the whole point of the immigration discussion as far as the left is concerned. Donald Trump makes it easy for them to make this argument, which is one of the problems I have with Trump. When they say, you know, immigration reform, and you say, they say, are you for immigration reform? And you say no. Then they say, you hate Mexicans, right? That's always the next line. It's on page 42 of the handbook. The proper answer to are you for immigration reform is, sure, I'd love immigration reform. Now, what specifically are you talking about? Right? So for a second, they think you're agreeing with them. And then it turns out you're not, because you're actually asking them to define terms. What the left likes to do is they like to pick terms that sound really nice. They happy-dappy-do, great terms that just sound great to everybody. Right? Aren't you for hope and change? You say, no, I'm for despair and rage, right? That actually is my campaign platform. But what you actually should do if somebody says, are you for hope and change, is you say, sure, I like hope, I like change. What the hell are you talking about? Right? Because what that means is that you're not dismissing them out of hand. You're asking them for clarification, and then they're in trouble because they don't think, again, in terms of what's under the surface. They just think in terms of these kind of broad terms, and this is the trick that they play. It's actually a brilliant trick. One of the things that they do is they pick terms they know 100% of people like, and then they redefine those terms to mean something that pretty much 0% of people like, right? Everybody likes hope. Everybody loves change. Not that many people are fond of a sagging economy and a flaccid foreign policy, right? It turns out not that, but that's what he means by hope and change. But if you say, no, I oppose your hope and change agenda, the hopey-changey thing, as Sarah Palin liked to say, right? If you say that, then they say, well, that's because you're a bad person, right? It always goes back to that original argument. Always reverse, right? You say you're against hope and change, it's because you're Eeyore. You're just terrible. Right? Okay. Final and tenth kind of point in arguing with the left, and that is body language actually matters when you're arguing with the left. Whoever gets angry first loses. That's the general rule of debate. Unless, again, Donald Trump violates every rule of debate. But aside from Donald Trump, assume you're not Donald Trump and you're not one of the world's most famous men before you start debating someone. Assume that you're just a normal human with a normal IQ, and you're asked to debate somebody. Well, then you should utilize good body language. So the Democrats are great at this, actually. They actually train in body language. Obama did, Clinton did. They had people who actually taught them specific body language moves. So Clinton, who's probably even better than Obama at body language, Clinton was very famous for doing this motion with his hand, right? When he's driving home a point, it's this, the elevator button push, right? He goes forward like this because if he goes like that, he's lecturing you. And if he goes like this, he's a fascist. But if he goes like this, right, then he's just gently prodding you. He's gently encouraging you. Like, seriously, these things actually matter, right? If I'm smiling when I make this speech, this is a very different speech than if I'm raging at you, right? These things make a difference. Body language, imagery, these things matter, right? In 2008, some of you, I think, are old enough to remember 2008. In 2008, if you can recall the conventions, Barack Obama descended from the clouds, a la Leni Riefenstahl, onto a stage with Greek pantheons behind him, and the trumpets blared, and Zeus crowned him king god, and it was amazing in front of 60,000 people, and it was just unbelievable. And then John McCain toddled onto a stage, holding a microphone between his hands, and he has physical infirmities because of his time being tortured, because he's an American hero. He's not a community organizer who's never done anything. And so he toddles, but for whatever reason, he toddles onto the stage, and he looks like John McCain, right? There's no way to change that. He looks like John McCain. And he proceeds to stand in front of a podium like this, and then behind him, they've put a lime green screen. Not like a green screen, right? Not like you and I would think of a green screen because we're technologically savvy, like a green screen where they're going to put some cool animation behind him with like a flowing American flag or a waterfall or a bald eagle or something. No, it's just a lime green screen, like they're making a pornography in San Fernando Valley. And then he proceeds to speak, and nobody hears a word he says because the imagery matters. There's a difference between the God King being crowned and a little old man speaking in somebody's basement. Right, so all of these things actually matter. So think about it. Like, you actually have to think about being well dressed, something that comes not naturally to me at all. You actually have to think about getting a haircut once in a while, dudes. You actually have to learn some elements of body language. Again, Bill Clinton was the best at this. Bill Clinton, he was famous for having 3 forms of handshake, 4 if you include Lewinsky, and it was he had the 3 forms of handshake were he would shake somebody, if he just was meeting you for the first time, he would go for the double hand clasp, right? He would clasp your hand. Nice to meet you, great to meet you. The second one was if you were a potential donor, right? And that was the hand here and then the other hand on the bicep, right? You're a good friend, right? You're an awesome dude. And then there was the kind of hug, right? That was if you were a big donor or a huge donor from China for whom he was going to declassify nuclear secrets. Then he grabs you by the hand and takes the other hand and puts it sort of on the back of your neck, on your shoulder, because you're just a dude and we're dudes together and it's awesome. So body language actually matters when you're debating people and in normal conversation when you just do politics as a general rule. This is why the most famous case, of course, is 1960, where Nixon wins the debate with Kennedy on the radio and loses the debate with Kennedy in terms of TV because he's sweaty and he's got the flu and he just bumped and he clocked his knee on the car and all this stuff and he's favoring one leg. It turns out that people actually do look at you and they make a decision about whether you're winning or losing in the first half a second of a debate, essentially. So those are your 10 rules for debating folks on the left. Now, the final point that I'd like to make here is that it is imperative that you enter the battle. And it's not, again, it's not going to be a choice for you. Right? We're now of a generation, and I'm not that much older than most of the people in the room. I'm 32. Right? And it's in my lifetime the obligation to become part of politics has actually risen dramatically. It used to be that when you turned on ESPN, you didn't get 8 minutes of the President of the United States giving his NCAA picks, right? Which is what I was working out yesterday, and that's what Obama was doing. It used to be that you could turn on a normal TV show and not be afraid of being hit with the politics of the left dramatically in your face. It used to be that you could have a normal conversation with people about politics without it verging on violence, which is essentially where we're moving. You're going to have to learn to enter the fray because they're not going to leave you alone. There's no such thing as the left leaving you alone anymore. Even all the people, you guys are politically motivated, but all the people out there, all the people who are conservative out there who think they can just live their lives and be left alone with their families, the government will just leave them be, the left will allow them to live their lives if they just keep quiet, it's nonsense. They're not going to allow them to do that. The left is firmly convinced that it is in the right, and the left is firmly convinced that it has both the capacity and the moral superiority to control every aspect of our lives because, again, we are benighted bad human beings. The only way to fight it back against that is, as President Obama's White House liked to say, to punch back twice as hard. Thanks so much. Happy to take questions.
My name is Duncan Repke. I go to Pacifica High School in Garden Grove, California. My question for you would be, I know you're an active supporter of the Never Trump movement, and I also agree with that, and my dad agrees with that, and many other conservatives agree with that. And what more do you think we can do besides not voting for Trump, like we've been doing the previous elections, picking the lesser of two evils, besides just not voting for those candidates moving forward? What else could we do to further the conservative movement?
Okay, so, I think that, you being involved with YAF is obviously a major way of doing that. You're active and you're part of an organization that actually is taking steps to try and convert people and have them join a broader conservative movement. For folks, this is a major debate, and it's going to rage all the way to the election, basically, between the Never Trump folks like me and people who say, well, if Trump gets the nomination, it's him or Hillary, you got to pick one. Right, and which is an argument that I perfectly understand, and I think that it's a decent argument. It's not a bad argument. The question is, what is your priority, right? If your priority is this election, is it this people are always saying this election is the most important election of our lifetime, and it's always true because the election that happened 4 years ago isn't as important as the one happening now by definition, right? You can't do anything about that one unless you have a time machine and it goes 88 miles an hour. So you're stuck in a position where whatever is happening now is the choice in front of you. The problem is that conservatives have always thought, because we're an older movement typically, YF's unique in this way, it's a young movement, but because conservatives are disproportionately old, they tend to think in terms of the next 6 months, not in terms of the next 60 years. Right? You can see how conservatives think by look at how conservatives see 1964 versus how Democrats see 1972. Right? Conservatives look at 1964 and they say, oh my God, that was just so terrible. We got blown out by Lyndon Baines Johnson, awful in every way. But if you think about it, without 64, there is no 1980, right? That's where Reagan really comes to national prominence with the time for choosing speech. Right after that, he starts running for president, essentially, for the next several election cycles. You don't get to 1980 without 1964. Conservatives should look at 64 and say, yes, that was a loss, but that was a loss in service of a greater gain. We lost the battle to win the war. Democrats do see things like that, right? Democrats look at 72 and they look at George McGovern and they say, God, that was a bad loss. But you know what that caused? We were in the wilderness for a while, but look at us now, right? We pushed hard to the left, and now we're embracing all of the things that George McGovern wanted. We are now pushing in the White House. We now own the White House because we pushed that hard that way. So the question is, are we going to build a movement or are we going to try and win an election? Normally, in a normal election cycle, you'd be able to say both, right? We have a candidate we can back. It's a great opportunity to both build a movement and win an election. The problem comes, what happens when you have a candidate who's not interested in your movement? What happens when you have a candidate who does not reflect conservatism in any way? And to me, that's Trump. I think Trump is a leftist in sheep's clothing. I think that he changes his mind every 5 seconds. I think he's an authoritarian egotist running for self-glorification. And I think that he is perverting the conservative movement into a Trump worship service. And that's disturbing to me on every level. To get back to your real question, though, as far as young people getting involved, be involved with YAF. Email me at bshapiro@dailywire.com. That's my email address. And we're building a grassroots movement, working with YAF too. And we need to all be. We're in this together because listen, we're either going to end up in the Gulag together or the White House together. Those are basically the two choices. So it's up to us.
Yes, Hi, I'm Maddie Mitchell, and I'm from Hillsborough, Wisconsin. My question is that, as you see Trump the same way that I do, many are saying that this is going to be the end of the GOP party, and if he is our candidate, yes, thank you, nominee.
Yes.
Where do you see America in 4 years if Hillary and Trump are our options?
Okay, so, you know, I'll take them one at a time. If Hillary is the president, I think that we continue speeding along at 50 miles an hour toward the cliff. If Trump is the nominee, or if he wins the election rather, then I think we speed toward the cliff at 35 miles an hour, and he guts the conservative movement while he's at it. That's my objection to Trump. So the main objection people have to the Never Trump movement is, well, aren't you handing the Supreme Court over to Hillary, right? Hillary's going to have a 0% shot of picking somebody good. Trump is going to have a more than 0% shot of picking somebody good. I have two responses to this. Number one, I don't think that Donald Trump will actually pick somebody conservative because he's not a conservative. He's going to do whatever makes him popular. Donald Trump has a particular campaign style. He picks the most extreme position, and then if nobody likes it, he moves it. Right? And he's done this on literally every... He has not held a single steady political position for more than the last 15 seconds, except that he hates free trade, which he's wrong on. Right? That's literally the only position he's held consistently for the last 15 years. So the idea that he's going... No, don't worry, we'll control Trump when he's in the... You got to be kidding me. Nobody controls Trump. His wives can't control Trump. Right? Nobody controls Trump. So you know, as far as, you know, what happens if, beyond that, I have a structural objection to the idea that all of American liberty rests on one justice on the Supreme Court. If we're that close to the end of liberty in the United States, liberty's gone already. It's just when Scalia died and we all felt like conservatism had a stake rammed through its heart, that means that conservatism was the walking dead already. It was just waiting for somebody to put that stake through its heart. The reality is that if conservatism is to return, it's not going to return on the national level faster than it returns on the local and state level, where Republicans actually are dominant. And the fact is that Gerald Rosenberg is getting a little obscure, but Gerald Rosenberg wrote a very good book I think it was in the early 90s, called The Hallowed Hope, talking about what the Supreme Court actually does and what they don't do. And he makes a very strong case that for all of the talk about how the Supreme Court controls American life, that's not really true. The Supreme Court sort of follows trends that are late to the ball game usually, and in essence, it comes down to the states anyway if the states are to resist the federal government. So, again, to me, the survival of the conservative movement is more important even than that fifth justice on the Supreme Court.
Hi, my name is John. I'm from San Diego High School, and I wanted to ask, well, very recently you did resign from Breitbart, or some of us know as Trumpbart. I wanted to ask, why did you feel that you needed to resign, even though you had a really high position at that place? And if you could also explain the philosophy of Andrew Breitbart.
So I'll start with the philosophy of Andrew Breitbart, and then I'll say sort of what I can on this topic because there are legal matters pending. So the philosophy of Andrew Breitbart wasn't even really conservatism as much as it was there are bullies out there and you need to fight them. Right? Andrew was not a political guy. If anybody who knows Andrew knows this. Right? I knew Andrew for a long time. I knew him since I was your age. I knew him when I met Andrew when I was 17 years old, and I knew him until his death. And we were good friends. And Andrew was not somebody. He was not a policy wonk. He didn't really care that deeply about policy. What he didn't like is people being lied about, and he didn't like bullying. These were his two big things: lies and bullying, particularly by the media. If you read his book, Righteous Indignation, which is a very good book, he talks about what his goals were and what his mission was, and he always said that it was to destroy the Democrat media complex, this kind of sick combination between the left in politics and the left in the media that covers up for lies and bullies people into submission. That was his chief goal. The reason I resigned from Breitbart, and I said this in my statement, was because, for those who missed it, there's a reporter for Breitbart. Her name is Michelle Field. I really only knew Michelle quasi-peripherally, actually, and Michelle said that she had been grabbed by Corey Lewandowski, who is Trump's campaign manager, and bruised on the arm. That was the baseline of what she said, that she'd been grabbed and she'd been bruised on the arm. And Breitbart, instead of defending its own reporter, came back with, they attempted to first say, they sort of gave a tepid ask for an apology to Corey Lewandowski, and then when he smeared Michelle as an attention seeker and a fabricator and a liar, they then came back on last Friday, they came back with a piece suggesting that Michelle had gotten the story completely wrong, even though it was already backed up by Ben Terrace, who was at the Washington Post, even though it had been caught on contemporaneous audio tape and videotape. They said, well, no, it was probably a Secret Service agent. And at that point I said, okay, any site, look, everybody who objectively looks at Breitbart knows that it's a very pro-Trump website. It has been for the last 6 months. And that's fine. I mean, if you're going to be open about your bias, be open about your bias. I run a site called Daily Wire, and Daily Wire is a very pro-Cruz website, right? I'm very pro-Cruz. That bias is reflected in our editorializing, right? I think Cruz is the best conservative candidate in the race. And I hope I'm honest enough to still analyze the race. I mean, like, for example, in the last debate grades, I gave Donald Trump an A for what it's worth, and I gave Ted Cruz a B. But whatever your editorial policy, that's one thing. Violating the basic bounds of decency, which says not only that you defend your reporter from being physically bruised by a campaign manager, but that you also defend the truth. This seems to me a baseline level of decency, and once you cross that level of decency, I don't care which side you're on, right, left, or center, which candidate you back, Cruz, Kasich, or Trump. At that point, I'm out. I can't be part of any organization that won't stand for truth or decency above loyalty to a particular political candidate. That's what I said in my statement. That's already been public record and obviously a major news story.
Hey, Ben. Thank you very much for speaking today. Always love listening to you. So I had a quick question. So when you talk to people, or I have some friends that believe that they can't really make a difference, or that their vote doesn't count, or that politics is negative, so they don't want to get involved. What do you say to people like that to spur them on to make a difference? Or
well, I mean, mathematically your vote doesn't count, so I don't argue, especially if you're in California. My vote hasn't counted my entire life. So, but it's not the voting that makes the difference. It's the way that people are convinced. I think one of the great lies of American politics is that people are convinced by watching the candidates. I don't think that's true. I think people are convinced in slow, steady fashion by the people who surround them. I think that you learned your politics from your parents and your friends and the cultural influences in which you engage. I think that's true for all of us. Very few people come to an election and they just go, oh, I'm going to open-mindedly look at these two candidates and decide which of their policies this best. That's a mythical version of the voter. It doesn't exist. What that means is that every time you engage in a conversation, you're shaping the future of American politics. Because if you convince somebody, I mean, not to sound like I'm pushing a pyramid scheme, but that's essentially what conversations are. It spreads beyond the conversation that you're having. This is particularly true if you're doing it in front of a lot of people, because then that can actually have an impact on a lot of folks. I mean, I have to say I'm constantly moved by the fact that there are so many. I do this podcast, and I would say 75 to 80% of the mail I get is from people under 20, and probably 30% of it is from people under 13. And that's because if you speak truth into the void, it's not a void. There are people out there. So just keep speaking truth. And people are pessimistic now, and I'm a pessimist by nature because for me pessimism is realism. But you're not. Your obligation to fight has not been relieved just because the battle is fierce and difficult.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. I'm Gabrielle DeRozier, and I'm from La Costa Canyon High School in Carlsbad, California. Regarding your points about how to approach a Democrat, or the liberals, so obviously I'm in Southern California, which is pretty heavily armed with a lot of liberals. So when dealing with students, like my peers, I feel that your points are very useful to have in our repertoire, but when dealing with our teachers, I feel like kind of a little bit more trepidatious when I try to approach them, especially with one of your points in exposing them a Democrat in front of like a large crowd. How should I approach dealing with my teachers?
This is a great question. So number one, I share your lament. I'm from SoCal also my whole life. And as far as how to deal with teachers, be smart. I mean, I've said this in every speech ever. Don't get an F just to tick off your teacher, right? I mean, teachers are unfortunately notoriously small-minded, and so if you say something with which they disagree, very often they will punish you in the classroom. So you sort of have to gauge the cost-benefit analysis. But what I found most useful when I was in college was not to. It depends. I mean, when I was at UCLA, most of my papers were graded anonymously. So which meant we used blue books at UCLA. And so this doesn't typically happen in high school, but when you get to college, it's more useful. You use blue books at UCLA, which means that you write your student ID number, but not your name. So what I would do is I would be a hardcore conservative in class. I'd speak up against the teacher, tell the teacher was wrong, and then I would write like an out-and-out Bernie Sanders communist in my blue books, and that's how I graduated summa cum laude from UCLA. So, so in other words, don't sacrifice future success for present satisfaction at getting in a jab. Look down the line, see what your interest is. I think the question that conservatives should always be asking themselves, first and foremost, after, what are your values, are what purpose does this serve? Right? We're utilitarians when it comes to politics. What purpose does this conversation serve? What purpose does what I'm doing now serve? What purpose does this, I ask myself this about TV appearances, for example. What purpose does this TV appearance serve? So, for example, I was asked on Comedy Central a couple of years ago, and I said no. And the reason I said no is because they insisted on pre-taping it, and I said I'll only do it live. And they didn't want to do it live for obvious reasons. So it didn't serve my purpose, so I said no. Right? The question, what purpose does this serve, will serve you well throughout your career and throughout your academic career as well.
Hi, my name is Sean. So earlier when you were talking about beginning a debate, you spoke very strongly about their points of view and how to approach it. But from what I see it, there are two types of arguments they'll make. They'll make moral arguments, obviously, but the way you can answer it is with policy. But what if it comes down to a moral issue for the topic of abortion? When it comes down to it, is purely a personal difference. So how do you argue personal differences in a debate? How do you try and convince people who have different points of view than you?
Okay, so this is the first thing that I would say is that when they argue morality, you should not argue policy. You will always lose. Morality always beats policy. It's why Republicans lose. Right? When they argue that it's immoral for you not to be nicer to the poor, and you argue, yes, but your policies are ineffective. Okay, immoral beats ineffective in an argument any day. So when it comes to purely moral issues, social issues like abortion, to get more specific, the reality is that abortion is not a complex issue. It's a very simple issue. That's either a life or it isn't. It's that simple. If it's a life, you can't kill it. If it's not a life, you can do whatever you want. It's a kidney. Right? So, and then it becomes, okay, so how do we define life? And the answer to me is you define life by the same way that you would define life if you found it on Mars, right? If you found a single-celled organism on Mars, it's a life, right? And I know, as somebody who has one baby and another on the way, that what's in there is not a random piece of tissue. At the very least, even if you don't believe it's a life yet, it's certainly a potential human life, and that seems to be more valuable than your convenience. And there's something nasty and cruel and degrading about the idea that you get to decide whether something is a life or not based on whether it's convenient to you or because it's in your body. By the way, this is exactly, it truly is amazing actually how history repeats itself. The argument in favor of abortion is exactly the same as the argument in favor of slavery. Exactly the same, right? You're on my land, I get to decide. It's up to me to decide whether you're a person or property. It's up to me, right? What are you going to say? It's on my land, what are you going to do about it? So when you have women who say it's in my womb, I get to decide based on what I feel today. I look into my heart, and I decide whether this is a child or not. Well, it turns out that in human history, there's a long and inglorious chain of people who said, I get to decide whether this person is a person or not, and it never ends with anything but mass death. So if you want to be that person who says, okay, that's not a human life, I'm just going to flush it down the toilet because it's personal convenience, you can always tell, by the way, who is losing an argument by who's using the euphemisms. When it comes to abortion, the left uses nothing but euphemisms. Abortion, terminate the pregnancy, pro-choice. They never say, oh no, what I would really prefer to do is go in there with some steel instruments, cut that baby apart and suck its brain into a sink. Right? For some odd reason, they don't like talking like that. I can't imagine why. So, I've never been a fan of pussyfooting around this particular issue. I think that it would be well worthwhile for whoever the Republican nominee is. One won't do it, but it would be nice if somebody would go onto a stage with Hillary Clinton and say, your stated position is that this child, then reach into his breast pocket and pull out a picture of a child at 30 weeks and say that this child can be murdered at the whim of the mother. This is your stated position. You believe that this is not a human, right? This is a piece of flesh. It's a piece of random flesh. This makes you a bad person, right? It does. I'm sorry. It makes you a bad person. My wife's 30 weeks pregnant right now. That baby's kicking the hell out of her. I promise you, that ain't a random piece of flesh in there. That's my child and it's her child. And anybody who says differently ought to be caned. It's disgusting. And just to clarify for the Donald Trump voters, that's not literal. People shouldn't actually be caned for their opinions.
Is this on? I'm Mackenzie and I go to Carpenter High School. And I often get asked questions about abortion all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's really difficult for me to come back with, my answer. And people always ask, well, what if the woman is raped? What do you do? What would you say in that case?
Yeah, so what I always say with regard to rape, for example, is that if a woman is raped, we should find her rapist, we should track him down, and we should kill him, right? Or castrate him. These are my two options. Pick one. Whichever one you please, right? Either one of those is okay. Also, it's bad to kill babies. That's my answer. They're completely unrelated. The two topics are completely unrelated. The source of the pregnancy and whether that's a human life in there are two completely unrelated topics. Right? It's a very difficult emotional issue, which is why my personal view of abortion is that when the mother's life is in danger, then abortion is appropriate. That's my exception. Not the health of the mother, the life of the mother. And for me, that includes suicidality, for example. So if a woman is suicidal and she's going to kill herself because she doesn't want to bear this child, then abortion is appropriate. But other than that, these are two separate issues, right? Because rape is wrong, and so is killing babies, it turns out. Two things can both be wrong. They're not equally wrong. You know, in fact, it depends which way you view it. But the fact is that what they want to do is they also, let's be real about this, what the left wants to do is pick the outlier and then use it to justify all the rest of the abortions. Okay, 99% of the abortions in this country have nothing to do with rape. Nothing to do with rape. They have to do with people having irresponsible sex. They have to do with convenience. They have to do with age. They have to do with they don't like whether it's a boy or a girl. So what they like to do is they like to take the one outlier case and the one that tugs at the heartstrings and then say, well, let's just make abortion legal in all circumstances based on that. How about this? I'll make an agreement with the left. Let's outlaw all rape except for rape. Now are they happy? Of course not. Right? Of course not, because they're not really talking about rape. They're talking about how they want all abortions to be legal, and they're using a marginal example as the rule in order to make sure that abortion is legal across the board. You should say that to them. If they say rape, you should say, listen, how about this? We'll make a deal. All of the pregnancies that do not spring from rape must be carried through to term. Now are you happy? They won't be happy, I promise you. And that's how you expose them. That's how you say, well, then it really isn't about the rape, is it? You're just using that as an excuse.
Hi, Ben. My name is Matthew, and I go to a school, a Catholic private school that is full of leftist, statist punks, and I hate them. And my...
It's like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting.
Yeah. It's an oxymoron, I tell you. So in the very rare case where a leftist uses evidence, logic, and empiricism, how do I combat, like, statistics they propose?
Who is it and when has it happened ever?
Thank you for answering my question.
The truth is, the real answer to that question is do your research, right? I mean, before I do a debate, I never go into a debate without researching my opponent's writings and positions ever. It's just like a sports game. You have to research your opponent. It's a boxing match. You have to scout how your opponent fights, and then you have to gauge your opponent. I never walk into any debate without doing deep prep.
Yeah, my name is Skylar Wilcoxon, and I go to Arcadia High School in Phoenix. And when you come of age of 35, would you ever run for office?
Would I ever run for office? Well, apparently anybody can. This is what we're finding out.
Right?
This is what we're finding out this time around. So yeah, why the heck not? It might be fun at some point. I mean, I'm not sure how it would go over, but but you know, it would be. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, Ben Carson could do it. And so is Donald Trump, and he's winning, just like Charlie Sheen. So so sure, why not? I'm not going to rule anything out. I'm only 32. There's plenty of time for me to rule that out later.
I'm Mr. Shapiro. I'm Sebastian from Los Angeles. So you mentioned you support Ted Cruz. Realistically, what path do you see for him to get the nomination? And more importantly, how does he beat Hillary in a general election?
The path to Ted Cruz winning the nomination is for John Kasich to immediately fall into a deep sleep and not awaken for several months. That's the actual path for Ted Cruz to win the nomination. Unfortunately, Kasich is sucking up a lot of the votes that Cruz needs in order to overcome Trump. And the other possibility is, and this still has to do with Kasich, is that enough votes are deprived of Trump that he doesn't get to 1,237 delegates, right, and we go to an open convention. If we go to an open convention, Trump is doing what Trump does. He's doing the Joe Pesci routine. Right? It'd be a shame if this entire convention burned down because my supporters riot. Wouldn't that be terrible? I'm not endorsing it. I'm not endorsing this thing. I'm not endorsing this thing, right? But if it happened, if it went to an open convention, if it went to an open convention, then the question becomes: do people actually stop him if he has the most delegates, but he doesn't have a majority? I think Kasich is going to prevent that. I think the only reason Kasich is in the race right now is to actually do that, to prevent Trump from getting to 1237, and then to trade his votes for a VP slot. And as I was saying to somebody earlier today, my worst nightmare when this process started, literally my worst nightmare, would have been a Trump Kasich ticket. Like when this process, that is a double scoop of dog poop. I mean, that is just, and no matter how much whipped cream you put on that one, it ain't going to taste good. So that's just, it's a disaster area. I mean, if you follow, I live blog all of the debates, and if you ever follow me live blogging the debates or live tweeting the debates, there's only one line. Whenever John Kasich talks, I'm not sure I've ever described anything he's ever said. The only thing I do is I put it on caps lock and I write, "Oh God, please God, no, not John Kasich." So, in other words, Cruz has some problems. So, his path to the nomination relies heavily on party elders leaning on John Kasich to get out for the good of the party, or alternatively, on presidential candidates putting aside their egos on behalf of the betterment of the country. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eric from Fullerton, California, and I was just wondering, we've been hearing from Republican elders that if Trump gets a nomination, there's a possibility of a third party forming. Mm-hmm. What would you do in that circumstance?
Well, I mean, I've already said openly I'm not voting for Trump in the general election because of the threat that he poses to the conservative movement. So if a conservative candidate that I liked, the easiest path would be to hijack the Libertarian Party, for example. Just go to the Libertarian Convention, hijack the nomination. The Libertarians are already registered on all the ballots in the different states, and then let's say that Cruz isn't going to do this, but let's say, by way of example, that Cruz decided, okay, I'll put up a third-party candidacy simply because I want to maintain a core of a conservative movement, then I would vote for Cruz. But listen, if no third-party candidate appeals to me, I simply won't vote at the top of the ticket. I'll vote further down the ticket. But I think that Trump is that grave a threat to conservative. Look, this is obviously this is a controversial position. It's something Republicans are going to be slugging out for months. But the key question that everybody should keep in mind on this debate, like do you vote for Trump or not, is which do you think is more important? Is it this election and stopping Hillary Clinton from doing all the terrible things we know she will do? Or is it the future of the conservative movement, if you agree with me that Donald Trump is going to hijack the conservative movement and transform it into something that more resembles a strong nationalist, big government, centralized government populism?
All right, this will be the last question.
Hi, I'm Mona from Canyon High School in Orange County. When did you first realize that you wanted to pursue your interests in politics, and why?
So I was looking back at my papers from when I was a kid, and I found one that I wrote when I was 11 talking about why Clinton should be impeached. So I'm pretty sure that it was early. But I got really involved. When I went to college, I was actually at that time a top-notch violinist. So I thought that I was actually going to go to Johns Hopkins and Peabody School of Music, and I thought I was going to double major in music and genetic science. Actually, I thought I wanted to go into science. And because I graduated high school at 16, my parents said, "You're not going all the way across the country. You're living at home, and you're going to a local school." So I ended up at UCLA. So I started off at UCLA, and I hadn't registered a major, and literally the first day that I was on campus, I think, if not the first day, certainly the first week, the first couple of hours I was on campus, I saw an article in the UCLA Daily Bruin comparing Ariel Sharon, who was then the prime minister of Israel, to Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi. And so I walked into the Daily Bruin offices and I said, "That's a terrible piece. I'd like to pen a counter to that." Which, by the way, for the left, that's how free speech works, gang, right? And try to burn the paper. So I went in and I said, "I'd like to write a counter." And that turned into them saying, "Okay, well, we've never seen one of